Sometimes the coldest moments in life have nothing to do with the weather. Sometimes you find yourself completely alone, with nowhere to turn and no one who cares whether you make it through the night. Wyoming, 1882. Margaret Ellis sat on a frozen bench at a mountain station after a blizzard shut down the rail line. Everyone else had gone home. She had no home to return to. The town wanted nothing to do with a penniless widow, and the train east never came. Then a mountain man named Elias Boone rode out of the storm and found her there. What he did next changed both their lives forever. But what happens when two people who've lost everything find each other in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elias Boone had not expected to find another soul at the station. He had certainly not expected to find a woman half frozen on a bench, her lips pale as snow, her hands clutching a piece of paper like it was the only tether keeping her from drifting away entirely. The wind howled through the empty platform, and his horse shifted beneath him, steam rising from its nostrils in the bitter cold. He had been coming down from the high country for 3 days, riding the narrow passes as winter tightened its grip on the Wyoming mountains. 5 years he had lived up there, alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands, far from towns and people and the memories that had once threatened to drown him. 5 years since he had buried his wife Sarah and his daughter Emma in graves he dug himself, the ground frozen solid, his hands bleeding by the time he finished. They had died within 2 days of each other, fever sweeping through them like wildfire, and he had been powerless to stop it. The men who brought that fever had been traders passing through. They knew they were sick. They came anyway, selling their wares, shaking hands, spreading death. After Sarah and Emma were gone, Elias tracked those men across 2 territories. Found them in a camp near the Colorado border. He did not speak much when he found them. He simply shot them, one by one, and left their bodies for the carrion birds. He became a wanted man that day. Not in the way of outlaws who robbed banks or rustled cattle, but wanted nonetheless. He fled to the mountains, where no lawman would follow, where the winters were brutal enough to keep even the desperate away. He learned to live with silence, with loneliness, with the weight of what he had done. But now, looking down at the woman on the bench, he felt something stir in him that he thought had died with his family. Not quite pity, not quite recognition, something deeper. The understanding that comes when you see another person standing on the same edge you once stood on. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The woman did not look up. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Ice crystals had formed on her eyelashes. "Ma'am," he said softly. She did not respond. He knelt beside her, pulling off one glove to touch her hand. Her skin was cold as stone. He looked around the empty station. The ticket window was shuttered. No smoke came from the station master's chimney. Everyone had gone home hours ago, maybe days ago. The rail line had shut down when the blizzard hit, and it would not run again until spring broke the passes. "Ma'am," he said again, more urgently this time, "you need to wake up." Her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed, deep brown like creek water running over stones. They focused on him slowly, confusion giving way to fear. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "I'm freezing." "I know," he said. "Can you stand?" She tried. Her legs buckled. He caught her before she fell, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Through her thin coat he could feel how frail she had become. How long had she been sitting here? "My bag," she murmured, gesturing weakly toward a small carpet bag on the ground. He picked it up with one hand, holding her with the other, and carried both to his horse. Getting her onto the saddle took effort. She could barely hold herself upright. He mounted behind her, wrapping his coat around them both, and turned the horse toward the mountains. The ride to his cabin took 4 hours. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, slumping against him. He kept talking to her, low and steady, telling her to stay awake, to hold on. He did not know if she heard him. The snow fell harder as they climbed, and the wind cut through even his thick layers. But his horse knew the way, and eventually the cabin appeared through the trees, small and solid and warm. He carried her inside and laid her near the fireplace. The embers from that morning still glowed faintly. He built up the fire quickly, coaxing flames from kindling, adding larger logs until heat began to fill the single room. Then he turned his attention to the woman. Her name, he would learn later, was Margaret Ellis. She was 28 years old, though grief had aged her face. She had been married to Thomas Ellis, a shopkeeper in a town 2 days' ride from here. Thomas had died of pneumonia 8 weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but debts. The creditors came first. Then the landlord. Margaret had nowhere to go and no money to get there. Thomas's brother and sister-in-law made it clear she was not welcome in their home. A penniless widow was a burden, they said, an embarrassment. So Margaret had sold what little she had left and bought a ticket east to a cousin in Ohio she had not seen in 10 years. She did not know if the cousin would take her in. She had no other plan. But the train never came. The blizzard closed the pass, and the station master left, and everyone else found shelter, and Margaret simply sat on that bench because she had nowhere else to go. She had clutched Thomas's last letter to her, written the week before he died, telling her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for leaving her with nothing. But Elias did not know any of this yet. All he knew was that a woman was dying in front of him, and he had to save her. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He heated water and made her drink broth, spoonful by careful spoonful. He checked her hands and feet for frostbite, relieved to find only superficial damage. Throughout it all, she said nothing. Her eyes followed him, wary and exhausted, but she did not speak. When she finally fell into real sleep, her breathing deep and even, Elias sat back and looked at her. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and spread across the pillow. Her face, now that color was returning to it, was handsome in a quiet way. Strong bones, determined chin. The kind of face that had seen hardship and survived it. He stood and walked to the window. Night had fallen completely. Snow continued to fall, heavy and relentless. The pass would be closed now, completely impassable. Even if she wanted to leave, even if she had somewhere to go, she could not. Not for weeks, maybe months. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman, the first person to set foot in this cabin since he built it 5 years ago. He did not know what to do with that, did not know what it meant. He had saved her life, yes. But now what? Elias looked at his shelf, where he kept Sarah's things. Her hairbrush, her sewing kit, the wooden doll he had carved for Emma. He had not touched these items in years, could not bear to. But they were there, always there, reminding him of what he had lost, what he had done, what he had run from. The woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he could not make out. He turned back to look at her. She seemed impossibly small in his large bed, surrounded by his rough blankets, vulnerable, dependent on him now. He had spent 5 years alone by choice. 5 years of silence and solitude, of living with his guilt and his grief. He had told himself it was what he deserved, that he would never again let anyone close enough to lose. That he was safer alone, and the world was safer without him in it. But here she was, this woman, this stranger, already disrupting everything. Elias returned to his chair by the fire and sat down heavily. He did not sleep that night. He simply watched her breathe and wondered what morning would bring. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was rough timber, not the painted plaster of the boarding house where she had spent her last night in town. The blankets covering her were heavy wool, scratchy against her skin, nothing like the thin cotton sheets she had known with Thomas. Then memory returned in a rush. The station, the cold, the man on horseback. She sat up too quickly and her head spun. A hand steadied her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Easy now," the man said. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Margaret turned to look at him properly for the first time. He was older than she had realized, perhaps 40, with a weathered face and grey threading through his dark beard. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter sky. There was kindness in them, but also something guarded, something careful. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp. "My cabin, about 15 miles up from the station." He handed her a tin cup. "Drink this, slowly." The coffee was strong and bitter but warm. She wrapped both hands around the cup and sipped, feeling the heat spread through her chest. As her mind cleared, awareness crept in. She was in a strange man's home, alone with him, miles from anywhere. "I should leave," she said, though she made no move to stand. "Can't," he said simply. "Storm closed the pass last night. Won't open again until spring." Margaret stared at him. "Spring, that's months away. February most likely. March if we get more snow. But I can't stay here." Panic rose in her throat. "I have to get east. My cousin is expecting me." The man's expression did not change. "Your cousin will have to wait. You try to cross that pass now, you'll die. Simple as that." The words were blunt but not unkind. Margaret looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass, thick and white. She could barely see the trees beyond. The reality of her situation settled over her like a weight. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Elias Boone." He paused. "And you are?" "Margaret Ellis." She hesitated, then added, "Widow Ellis." He nodded, as if he had already guessed. "I'm sorry for your loss." The formal words, so often meaningless, sounded genuine coming from him. Margaret found herself believing he understood. Something about the way he carried himself, the careful distance he maintained, suggested a man who knew grief firsthand. "How long have I been here?"
she asked. "Day and a half."
"You slept through yesterday entirely." Margaret looked down at herself. She was still wearing her dress, though someone had removed her boots and coat. The impropriety of the situation struck her fully. A widow alone with a bachelor in his home. If anyone in town knew, her reputation would be destroyed completely. Not that she had much reputation left to lose. "I have no way to pay you," she said quietly. "For your help, for the food. I have almost nothing. I'm not asking for payment. Then what do you want?" Elias stood and walked to the stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. "I want you to eat this stew and get your strength back. That's all." He handed her the bowl. It smelled of venison and root vegetables. Her stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it was painful. She had not eaten a real meal in days. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded and returned to his chair by the fireplace. He picked up a piece of leather and a knife, resuming work on what looked like a harness repair. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. Margaret ate slowly, studying him when she thought he was not watching. His hands moved with practiced skill over the leather. Everything in the cabin spoke of self-sufficiency. The neat shelves of preserved food, the tools hanging on pegs, the firewood stacked precisely by the door. This was a man who had lived alone for a long time. "Who preferred it that way? Why did you help me?" she asked finally. Elias did not look up from his work. Seemed like the right thing to do. Most men would have ridden past. "I'm not most men." There was no boastfulness in the statement. Just fact. Margaret set down the empty bowl and pulled the blankets closer around her shoulders. The cabin was warm, but she could not seem to stop shivering. Shock, perhaps. Or the simple weight of understanding that her life had taken yet another turn she had not chosen. "I won't be a burden," she said. "I can cook, clean, mend things. I'll earn my keep. That's not necessary. It is to me." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I've already been too much of a burden. To Thomas's family. To the town. I won't be that again." Elias finally looked up. His eyes met hers, steady and measuring. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Ellis. You're a person who needed help. There's a difference." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She turned away, embarrassed. She had cried so much in the past 2 months that she thought she had no tears left. But kindness, unexpected kindness, seemed to unlock something in her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What will people think when they find out I spent the winter here with you?" "No one's going to find out. No one comes up here." "Haven't seen another soul in 5 years. 5 years?" Margaret looked at him with new understanding. "You've been alone that long?" "By choice." The way he said it made clear the subject was closed. Margaret did not press. She understood about things one did not wish to discuss, about pain too deep for casual conversation. The day passed slowly. Elias showed her where things were. The privy out back, the well that had to be cleared of snow each morning, the root cellar dug into the hillside. He explained the routine of the place, the work that needed doing. Margaret listened carefully, committing it all to memory. If she was going to be here for months, she needed to be useful, needed to contribute. It was the only way she could bear it. That night, as darkness fell early and complete, Elias gave her the bed and took a pallet by the fire. Margaret protested, but he would not hear otherwise. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to his quiet breathing across the room. The strangeness of it all felt overwhelming. Just weeks ago she had been married, settled, secure. Now Thomas was dead, her home was gone, and she was trapped in a mountain cabin with a man she did not know, but he had saved her life. She knew that with certainty. Without him, she would have frozen on that bench, would have died alone and unmissed. Whatever happened now, whatever this winter brought, she owed him for that. In the darkness, Margaret reached under her pillow and found the letter she had been clutching at the station. Thomas's last letter. She could not read it in the dark, but she knew every word by heart. He had promised her everything would be all right, that they would build a good life together, that he would always take care of her, all promises he could not keep. Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Tomorrow she would begin learning how to survive in this place, how to live in this strange new world where she was neither wife nor widow, neither guest nor prisoner. Somewhere in between, somewhere undefined. Across the room, Elias shifted on his pallet. Margaret wondered what he was thinking, what had driven him to this isolation, what he had lost that made solitude preferable to the company of others. She wondered if she would ever know, if he would ever trust her enough to tell her, if they could survive months together in this small space without one or both of them breaking under the weight of proximity and memory. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. The storm was far from over, and so, Margaret realized, was her ordeal. It was only just beginning. By the third week, cabin fever had begun to set in. The walls seemed to press closer each day, and Margaret found herself staring out the window for hours, watching snow fall on snow, white upon white until the world disappeared. Elias noticed her restlessness. One morning, after a clear night had left the world sparkling with frost, he said, "Get your warmest clothes on. We're going outside." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Outside? It must be 10 below, closer to 0. But the sun's out. Do you good to move around." He showed her a pair of snowshoes that had hung on the wall since she arrived. "These were Sarah's," he said. "Should fit you well enough." Margaret strapped them on, feeling awkward and ungainly. But when she stepped out into the deep snow and did not sink, she laughed with delight. Elias smiled at the sound, and they set off into the woods. He showed her how to read the forest, how to identify trees by their bark when leaves were gone, how to spot animal tracks and know what had passed and when. He pointed out where deer had scraped bark for food, where a fox had marked its territory, where ravens had gathered to dispute over some hidden prize. "The mountains talk," he said. "You just have to learn the language." Margaret listened, fascinated. She had spent her whole life in towns and settlements. The wilderness had always been something to fear, something to avoid. But Elias moved through it like he was part of it, reading signs she could not see, hearing sounds she could not distinguish. They followed a ridgeline to a clearing where the view opened up. Mountains stretched in every direction, white peaks against blue sky, going on forever. Margaret caught her breath at the beauty of it. "This is why you stay," she said, "part of it." Elias stood beside her, looking out over the vista. "Up here the world makes sense. Everything has its place, its purpose. Nothing's wasted or false. Don't you miss people?" "I miss specific people. Sarah, Emma, my brother, though I haven't seen him in 20 years. He paused. "But people in general? No, I don't miss the lying and the pretending. The way folks smile to your face and knife you when you turn. Around, not everyone's like that. Enough are." Margaret thought about the way her sister-in-law had smiled while telling her she could not stay. The way the neighbors had looked through her after Thomas died, like she had become invisible. The way the town had been so eager to be rid of a woman who had no money and no prospects. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. They stood in silence, watching the sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some tightness she had been carrying without realizing it. Out here, in all this space, she could breathe. On the way back, Elias showed her how to spot deadwood suitable for kindling, how to test snow depth with a stick before stepping, how to navigate by the sun. Margaret absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, for skills, for anything that would make her more capable in this place. When they returned to the cabin, both were flushed with cold and exertion. Margaret felt more alive than she had in months. The walls no longer pressed in. The space felt generous rather than confining. That evening, after supper, Elias did something he had not done before. He went to a wooden trunk in the corner and opened it. Margaret had noticed the trunk but never asked about it. Some things, she had learned, were private. He pulled out a small object and held it for a long moment before turning to face her. In his hands was a wooden doll carved with obvious care. The face was simple but expressive, the body jointed at arms and legs. "This was Emma's," he said. His voice was rough. "I made it for her 3rd birthday." Margaret set down her mending and waited. She sensed this was important, that Elias was sharing something he had not shared in years. "She took it everywhere," he continued. "Named it Rose after Sarah's mother. Talked to it like it was real." He smiled slightly sadly. "Sarah used to say Emma had a better relationship with the doll than with most of the children in town. She sounds like she was special." She was. Elias turned the doll over in his hands. She asked questions constantly. "Why is the sky blue? Where do stars come from? What happens when we die?" He paused. "I didn't have good answers for that last one." "Still don't." Margaret rose and crossed the room slowly. She stood beside Elias, looking down at the doll. "May I?" she asked softly. He nodded and handed it to her. Margaret cradled it carefully, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the careful craftsmanship. This had been held by a child, loved by a child. She felt the weight of that, the sacredness of it. "I never got to hold my own child," she said quietly. "Thomas and I tried for so long. I prayed, bargained with God, promised I would be the best mother if only he would give me a baby." She looked up at Elias. "He didn't, and I thought it meant I wasn't worthy, that I had failed at the most basic thing a woman should do. Margaret, but maybe," she continued, "maybe it just wasn't meant to be. Like you said, maybe not everything that doesn't happen is a failure." She handed the doll back to him, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Neither pulled away immediately. They stood close, the doll between them, and something passed in the air. An understanding, a recognition of shared pain, the beginning of something neither had expected. "Thank you for showing me this," Margaret whispered. "For trusting me with her memory." Elias nodded, unable to speak. He returned the doll to the trunk carefully, reverently. When he turned back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. "She always said the best people were the ones who had been broken and learned how to mend. I'm not sure I've learned how to mend. You're here, aren't you? You're still standing. That's mending." Margaret felt tears slip down her own cheeks. She did not try to hide them. In this place, with this man, she did not have to pretend to be anything other than what she was. Broken, grieving, but still here. Still standing, Elias reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. His touch was feather-light there and gone, but Margaret felt it echo through her entire body. "We're both still standing," he said softly. And in that moment, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with him. With this rough, kind, wounded man who lived alone in the mountains. With this stranger who had become the person who understood her better than anyone ever had. She knew it, and she was terrified. And she could not stop it. The 4th week brought a change in the rhythm between them. They moved around each other with a new awareness, careful not to touch, but always conscious of proximity. The air felt charged, like before a lightning strike. Margaret found herself watching Elias when she thought he was not looking. The way he moved, economical and sure. The way his hands worked wood or leather with patient skill. The way he sometimes stared into the fire with an expression so lost, she wanted to reach out and pull him back. She caught him watching her too, would turn from kneading bread to find his eyes on her, or look up from mending to meet his gaze across the room. Neither spoke of it, but the awareness hummed between them, persistent and growing. One morning Margaret was making bread and realized she needed to remove her wedding ring. The dough would stick to it, ruin the batch. She hesitated, looking at the simple gold band. She had not taken it off since Thomas placed it there 5 years ago. Even when he died, even when she left the town, she had kept it on, a marker of who she had been, what she had lost. She slipped it off slowly and placed it on the windowsill. Her finger felt strange without it, naked, light. Elias was at the table, working on the ledger where he tracked his supplies. He glanced up at the small sound of metal on wood. His eyes went to the ring, then to Margaret's bare hand, then away. He said nothing, but she knew he had noticed. Margaret kneaded the dough with more force than necessary, working out tension she could not name. When the bread was shaped and set to rise, she went to wash her hands at the basin. The ring sat on the windowsill, gleaming in the morning light. She reached for it, hesitated, then left it there. Just for now, she told herself. Just while the bread rises. But when the bread was baked and cooled, the ring still sat on the windowsill. And Margaret found she could not quite bring herself to put it back on. That afternoon, she was hauling water from the well when her foot caught on ice and she slipped. She would have fallen hard, but Elias was there, catching her, his arms solid around her waist. They froze like that, her hands clutching his shoulders, his arms holding her steady, face to face, so close she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, could feel his breath on her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not let go immediately. For a long moment they simply stood there, balanced on the edge of something neither was ready to name. Then Elias released her and stepped back, clearing his throat. "Careful," he said. "Ice is treacherous," Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She finished filling the bucket, her hands shaking slightly. When she returned to the cabin, Elias was already inside, standing by the window with his back to her. The evening passed in near silence. They moved around each other like planets in orbit, drawn by gravity, but afraid of collision. Margaret tried to focus on her mending, but her stitches were uneven, and she had to pull them out twice. When darkness fell and Elias prepared his pallet by the fire, neither spoke. But the tension was suffocating. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing. She could hear every sound Elias made, the rustle of blankets, the creak of the floor. His breathing, measured but not quite steady. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to find the cabin dark, except for the dying embers of the fire. But something was different. She sat up slowly and saw Elias sitting by the hearth, his head in his hands. "Elias," she whispered. He looked up, startled. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" "No, are you all right?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Then no, I'm not." Margaret rose and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She crossed the room and sat beside him. "What is it?" "I'm afraid," he said simply. "Of what?" "Of this." He gestured between them. "Of what's happening?" "Of caring again." He looked at her, and in the firelight she could see the fear in his eyes. "I can't lose someone again, Margaret. I can't survive it. You don't know that anything will happen," she said gently, "don't I? Life takes everything eventually. Everyone I've loved has been taken from me. My parents, my brother in a way, Sarah and Emma." His voice broke. "I came up here to stop feeling, to stop wanting, to stop being human enough to hurt. But you are human. You can't stop that." "I tried," he laughed bitterly. 5 years I tried. And then you appeared, and everything I built fell apart." Margaret felt her own fear rising to meet his. "I feel it too," she admitted. "I'm terrified. Thomas has only been gone 2 months. I should still be grieving. I'm still grieving. But I'm also—" She struggled to find the words. "I'm also feeling things I thought I would never feel again. And I don't know if that's wrong or right or just human. I keep thinking I'm betraying Sarah, that she would be hurt if she knew. Do you really believe that?" Elias considered. "No," he said finally. "Sarah was practical. She would tell me not to waste my life mourning her. But knowing that doesn't make the guilt go away." "I understand." Margaret reached out and took his hand. The gesture felt monumental, inevitable, Thomas was a good man, but I don't think he would begrudge me finding happiness. He wanted me to be cared for, protected. They sat in silence, hands clasped, both afraid and both unable to let go. What do we do? Elias asked finally. I don't know, Margaret admitted. But maybe we don't have to decide tonight. Maybe we just sit here together. So they did. They sat by the dying fire until dawn crept through the windows, holding hands like children afraid of the dark. Not speaking, not moving, just being present with each other and with their fear. When morning came, when the practical world reasserted itself and they had to rise and begin the day's work, something fundamental had shifted. They had named what was between them, had admitted it aloud, and though neither knew what would come next, they knew they would face it together. Margaret put on her apron for breakfast. On the windowsill, Thomas's ring still sat where she had left it the day before. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned away and began to cook. Early February brought a break in the weather. 3 days of clear, cold skies and no new snow. Elias studied the conditions and made a decision. I need to go to the trading post, he announced over breakfast. Supplies are running lower than I'd like. With 2 of us, things go faster, Margaret nodded. I'll come with you. No. The word was firm. It's a hard 2-day ride, and the trail's dangerous even in good conditions. I'm not helpless, Elias. I've proven I can handle. It's not about you being helpless. He set down his coffee. The trading post is where people talk, where news travels. If someone saw you with me, asked questions, it could cause problems. What kind of problems? He did not answer directly. Just trust me on this. You'll be safe here. I'll be back in 4 days at most. Margaret wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. There was more he was not saying, but she had learned when to press and when to let things rest. 4 days, she said. I'll expect you on the 4th day. He left before dawn the next morning. Margaret stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching him ride away. The cabin felt immediately too large and too quiet without him. She spent the first day doing chores with fierce energy, trying to outrun the loneliness. Chopped wood, hauled water, cleaned everything that could be cleaned. But by evening, the silence pressed in. She had grown so accustomed to Elias's presence that his absence was a physical ache. The 2nd day was worse. Time moved slowly. Margaret found herself starting at every sound, imagining dangers. What if his horse had gone lame? What if he had fallen? What if he was not coming back? She told herself she was being foolish. Elias had survived 5 years alone in these mountains. He knew how to take care of himself. But logic did not ease the tight knot of worry in her chest. To distract herself, Margaret began to explore the cabin more thoroughly. She had been respectful of Elias's space, not prying into things that were not her business. But now, alone and restless, curiosity got the better of her. She looked through his books, few, well-worn, mostly practical guides. She examined his tools, marveling at how carefully maintained they were. She opened the trunk where he kept Emma's doll, but did not touch anything inside. That felt too sacred even now. Then she noticed something she had not seen before, a slight unevenness in the floorboards near the stove. She knelt down and ran her fingers over the wood. One board was looser than the others. When she pried at it gently, it lifted. Beneath was a hollow space. And in that space, a leather pouch, a gun wrapped in oilcloth and a piece of paper. Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. It was old, weathered, the kind posted in sheriff's offices across the frontier. Her eyes scanned the words, and her heart began to race. Wanted for questioning Elias Boone, in connection with the deaths of 3 men near Colorado border. 1877 contact U.S. Marshal's office. Cheyenne below the text was a description that matched Elias perfectly. And a sketch, crude but recognizable. Margaret sat back on her heels, the paper clutched in her hands. Her mind spun. Elias was wanted by the law. Had killed 3 men. That was why he lived alone. Why he had refused to let her come to the trading post. Why he had hidden himself in these mountains for 5 years. She read the notice again, looking for details. In connection with, not for the murder of. Wanted for questioning, not wanted dead or alive. but it was enough. Enough to understand that Elias was running from something, that the law was looking for him. Her first instinct was fear. She was alone in a cabin with a man who had killed. What did she really know about him? What if she was in danger? But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. Elias had had countless opportunities to harm her, if that was his intent. Instead, he had saved her life, cared for her, treated her with gentleness and respect. Whatever he had done, whoever those men were, she could not believe he was a threat to her. Still, her hands shook as she replaced the notice and the other items, fitting the floorboard back into place. She sat on the floor for a long time, processing what she had learned. 3 men dead. 5 years in hiding. A life abandoned. What had happened? What could drive a man like Elias to kill? The answer came to her slowly, piecing together things he had said. The fever that killed his family. The men who brought it. His rage, his grief. She remembered his words. The men who brought that fever to our town, they knew they were sick. Came through selling goods anyway. He had hunted them down, killed them in revenge. Margaret pressed her hands to her face. She should be horrified, should be planning to leave as soon as the past cleared, should be grateful she had discovered this before it was too late. But what she felt instead was a deep, aching understanding. She thought of those days after Thomas died, when the grief was so overwhelming she could barely breathe. Thought of the rage she had felt at the unfairness of it all. If someone had been directly responsible for his death, if there had been a target for that rage, what might she have done? She could not say with certainty that she would have chosen differently than Elias. That night Margaret barely slept. She lay awake, going over everything in her mind. By morning she had made her decision. She would wait for Elias to return, would tell him what she had found, would give him a chance to explain, and then she would decide whether to stay or go. Elias returned on the afternoon of the 4th day as promised. Margaret heard the horse and went to the door. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him, alive and whole. But it was quickly replaced by apprehension. He knew immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "Nothing happened." "I'm fine." Margaret stepped back to let him enter. "But we need to talk." Elias set down the supplies he had brought and looked at her carefully. "All right." Margaret took a breath. "I found the notice." Under the floorboard, Elias went very still. His face emptied of expression. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "I see. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I'm not going to act like everything's the same." Margaret's voice was steady, though her heart pounded. "I need you to tell me what happened." "The truth." Elias sank into a chair. He looked suddenly older, weary. "The truth is I killed 3 men. Shot them, watched them die. Why?" "Because they murdered my family." His voice was flat. "They came through our town knowing they had fever, selling contaminated goods. They infected half the settlement. Sarah and Emma died because of them, because those men wanted profit more than they cared about lives. So you tracked them down." "I did. Took me a month. And found them in Colorado. Thought they'd gotten away with it." He looked up at her. "I didn't plan to kill them. I told myself I just wanted justice, wanted them brought to the law. But when I saw them laughing and drinking like nothing had happened, He broke off. "I shot them. All 3. Didn't give them a chance to defend themselves. Just executed them. And then you ran. I ran. Came up here where no one would follow. Where I could disappear." He stood, began to pace. "I'm not proud of what I did, Margaret. I've lived with it every day. The guilt. The knowledge that I became a murderer. That I'm no better than them." "You're nothing like them," Margaret said quietly. "How can you say that? You killed men who deserved to die, who murdered children." She moved closer to him. "I'm not saying it was right. I'm not saying the law shouldn't have handled it. But I understand why you did it." Elias stared at her. "You should be afraid of me." "I'm not. You should leave when the past clears. Get as far from me as you can. Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. You deserve better than—" "Let me decide what I deserve," Margaret interrupted. "I'm not a child. I'm not someone who needs protecting from the truth." She took his hand. "You saved my life. You've been kind to me. honest with me, except for this one thing you were right to keep hidden. Whatever you did 5 years ago, it doesn't change who you are now, doesn't it?" His voice was anguished. "How can you separate the two?" "Because people are more than the worst thing they've ever done. Because grief makes us capable of terrible things. Because She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "Because what?" "Because I love you," she said simply. "And love means seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway." Elias's expression crumbled. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she might disappear. "I don't deserve you," he whispered against her hair. "Maybe not. But you have me anyway." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other as the afternoon light faded. Outside, the mountains stood silent witness. Inside, two broken people chose each other despite everything. Despite reason, despite fear, despite the past that haunted them both. It was not the happy ending fairy tales promised, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. The days following Margaret's discovery brought a new honesty between them. The last wall had crumbled, and what remained was raw and real. They talked late into the nights, Elias telling her everything he had held back. About the aftermath of the killings, the chase across the territory, the terror of being hunted. About the first year in the cabin, when he had considered ending his own life more than once. About the slow process of learning to live with what he had done. Margaret listened without judgment, holding his hand when the words became too difficult. She shared her own darkness, the days after Thomas died, when she could not get out of bed, when food tasted like ash, and she wondered if it would be easier to simply stop existing. The shame she felt at her relief that he was gone, that she no longer had to pretend to be content in a marriage that felt like wearing a coat that did not quite fit. "I loved him," she said, "but I also felt trapped by him, by the life we had. And when he died, along with the grief, there was this terrible freedom, and I hated myself for feeling it." "Grief isn't simple," Elias said. "We're told it should be pure sadness, but it's not. It's anger and relief and guilt all mixed together." "Yes." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "Exactly that." They sat together in the firelight, two people who had finally stopped running from themselves, from their pasts, from the possibility of a future. "I've been thinking," Elias said after a while, "about what happens when the past clears." Margaret's heart constricted. "What have you been thinking?" "That I can't keep hiding forever. Can't keep living as a fugitive." He turned to face her. "If we're going to have a real life together, I need to face what I did. Turn myself in. Accept whatever judgment comes." "No." Margaret sat up straight. "Elias, they could hang you. Maybe, maybe not. It's been 5 years. The families might have moved on. The law might be satisfied with prison time." He took both her hands. "But I can't ask you to build a life with a wanted man. Can't ask you to live in hiding, always looking over your shoulder. I don't care about that. I care about keeping you alive." "I know. But Margaret, listen to me." His eyes were serious, determined. "I want to marry you, properly. In a church, with witnesses, with your name and mine written in a register for anyone to see. I want to build you a real home, not this cabin in the middle of nowhere. I want to give you the life you deserve. You've already given me a life. You saved me. I pulled you off a bench. You saved yourself." He smiled slightly. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. Strong enough to survive losing Thomas. Strong enough to live through a winter with a stranger in the wilderness. Strong enough to love a man who's done terrible things." Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. "Don't go, please. We'll stay here. We'll make it work. For how long? Until I'm too old to hunt? Until one of us gets sick or hurt and needs help we can't get up here." He wiped her tears gently. "I don't want to just survive with you, Margaret. I want to live." She knew he was right. Knew that a future built on hiding was no future at all. But the thought of losing him, of watching him ride away to face justice that might be his death, was unbearable. "Let me come with you," she said. "When you go, let me testify on your behalf. Tell them what kind of man you are. It might not make a difference, but it might. And I won't let you face it alone." Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "All right," he whispered. Together then, the decision made, they began to plan. They would wait until late February when the pass was most likely to be clear, but before the spring melt made the trails impassable. They would ride to Cheyenne, where the U.S. Marshal's office was located. Elias would turn himself in, and Margaret would hire a lawyer if she could afford one. "I have money saved," Elias said.
Hidden away.
"Enough for a lawyer. Enough for you to start over if—" "Don't," Margaret interrupted. "Don't talk about me starting over without you. We'll face this together, and we'll come through it together. You can't know that, neither can you. So we might as well hope." As the days passed and late February approached, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. There was a bittersweetness to everything. Every meal together might be one of the last. Every conversation might be the final one. Every touch carried the weight of potential goodbye. One evening, Elias went to the trunk where he kept his most precious belongings. He knelt before it, opened it slowly, and removed something small that glinted in the firelight. He returned to where Margaret sat by the fire and knelt in front of her. In his hand was a silver locket on a delicate chain. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly. "Her mother gave it to her on her wedding day." He opened it to show two small portraits inside, a woman who looked gentle and kind, and a little girl with Elias's eyes. "Sarah and Emma," Margaret's breath caught. "Elias, I can't—" "Yes, you can." He closed the locket and held it out to her. "Sarah would want you to have it. She would want to know that I loved again, that I chose to live again." His voice grew rough. "And Emma would want to know her father didn't give up, that he found someone who made him remember what it was like to have a family. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He fastened the locket around Margaret's neck. It settled just below her collarbone, warm from his hands. "You're not replacing them. You could never replace them. But you're giving me a reason to believe in the future. And they would want that for me." Margaret touched the locket with trembling fingers. The weight of it felt significant, sacred. "I'll take care of it. I promise. I know you will." Elias cupped her face in his hands. "Margaret, when this is all over, if we get through it, will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" She had known the question was coming, had felt it building between them for weeks. But hearing the words spoken aloud still made her heart leap. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They kissed then for the first time. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them aware of the magnitude of the moment. But it deepened quickly, years of loneliness and grief pouring into it. They were two people who had thought they would never feel this again. Never feel wanted, never feel whole, never feel the promise of tomorrow. When they finally pulled apart, both were shaking. Elias rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it before now. But I love you, Margaret. More than I thought I could love anyone again. I love you too." She kissed him again, softer this time. "And we're going to get through this. We're going to have our wedding and our future and everything we've been denied. You sound so certain." "I have to be. One of us has to believe it's possible." He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. "Then I'll believe it because you do." They held each other through the night, neither wanting to sleep, neither wanting to miss a moment of being together. Outside the wind shifted. The temperature rose slightly. Spring was coming, bringing with it both hope and reckoning. The next morning Elias packed his saddlebags. Not much, some clothes, his money, the wanted notice to present to the marshal. Margaret packed her own small bag, everything she owned fitting into a single carpet bag. Before they left, Elias walked through the cabin one more time. He touched the walls he had built, the furniture he had made, the tools he had used. This place had been his sanctuary and his prison. He had come here broken and hidden. He was leaving it still scarred, but no longer hiding. "Will you come back?" Margaret asked from the doorway. "I don't know." He looked around once more. "Maybe. Or maybe we'll build something new somewhere else. As long as we're together, I don't care where we are." They rode out as the sun rose, two figures on horseback heading down the mountain. The cabin grew smaller behind them, then disappeared entirely as the trees closed in. Neither looked back. The journey to Cheyenne would take a week, maybe more, depending on conditions. Every mile brought them closer to a future that was uncertain at best, catastrophic at worst. But they rode side by side, and in that there was strength. In that there was hope. Margaret reached up and touched the locket at her throat. She thought of Sarah and Emma, the woman and child who had loved Elias first. She hoped they would understand, hoped they would approve of what she and Elias were trying to build from the wreckage of their grief. The mountains fell away behind them. The plains opened up ahead, and somewhere in the distance, in a town they could not yet see, waited the law and justice and the answer to the question that had haunted them both. Could a man who had done terrible things for understandable reasons be forgiven? Could two people who had lost everything build something new from nothing? They would find out soon enough. Together they would find out. They were 3 days from Cheyenne when the riders appeared. Elias saw them first, 3 dark shapes against the snow-bright landscape. His hand went instinctively to the rifle on his saddle, but Margaret touched his arm. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let's see what they want." As the riders drew closer, Elias could make out details. 3 men, well-armed, riding with purpose. The one in front wore a star on his coat, a marshal's badge glinting in the weak winter sun. "Elias," Margaret whispered, fear tight in her voice. "I know." He reined in his horse and waited. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This was what he had been planning to face anyway. Just sooner than expected, the marshal was a man in his 50s, weathered and competent-looking. He rode up and stopped a respectful distance away, his hand resting on his sidearm, but not drawing it. "You'd be Elias Boone," the marshal said. "It was not a question. I am. Marshal Clayton Reed. These are my deputies, Miller and Hawthorne." He studied Elias carefully. "Been looking for you for quite some time." "I know. I was on my way to Cheyenne to turn myself in." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "That so?" "Yes, sir. Got the notice with me if you want to see it." "I believe you." Marshal Reed's eyes moved to Margaret. "And who might you be, ma'am?" "Margaret Ellis." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I'm with Mr. Boone. You know what he's wanted for?" "I do. And I'm prepared to testify on his behalf." The deputy called Hawthorne snorted. "Won't matter much what you have to say, lady. Man killed 3 people. That's a hanging offense." "Not necessarily," Marshal Reed said mildly. "Why don't we all take this conversation somewhere warmer? There's a line shack about 2 miles east. We'll stop there, sort things out proper." Elias exchanged a glance with Margaret. He could see her fear, but also her determination. He nodded to the marshal. "All right. But I want your word she won't be harmed or held. She's done nothing wrong. You have my word. Long as you don't give me cause to break it." They rode in silence to the line shack, a rough shelter used by cattlemen during drives. Inside, Marshal Reed built up the fire while his deputies kept watch at the door. Margaret stayed close to Elias, her hand finding his. "Now then," the marshal said, settling into a chair. "Why don't you tell me your side of this, Boone?" Elias told the story simply, without embellishment. His family, the fever, the men who brought it, his hunt for them, and what he did when he found them. He did not try to justify or excuse, just laid out the facts. Marshal Reed listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the lawman was quiet for a long moment. "Those 3 men," he said finally. "They were known troublemakers. Had warrants out in 2 territories for fraud and manslaughter. We'd been trying to catch up with them for months when you got to them first." Elias blinked. "I didn't know that. Figured you didn't. You weren't exactly doing research." The marshal sighed. "Look, Boone, I'm not going to tell you that you did the right thing. Law exists for a reason. Vigilante justice is still murder, no matter how you cut it. I know that, sir, but I also understand why you did it. And I'm a father myself. If someone killed my children, knowing they were spreading death, I can't say for certain I'd have acted differently." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. "What does that mean for Elias?" "Means I'm taking him in to face trial. That's not negotiable. But it also means I'll be testifying to the circumstances, the character of the men he killed. The provocation," he looked at Elias directly. "You give me your word you'll come peacefully. I won't shackle you. That's a courtesy I don't normally extend. You have my word," Elias said without hesitation. "Good." Marshal Reed stood. "We'll ride for Cheyenne tomorrow." Trial will be in about 2 months, Miss Ellis. That'll give you time to hire a lawyer if you can afford one. I can afford one, Margaret said firmly, and I'll be there. I'll testify to his character. The younger deputy, Miller, spoke up. He had been silent until now, watching everything with careful eyes. For what it's worth, sir, I lost my sister to fever 2 years back. Men who spread sickness knowing what they're doing, that's murder in my book. Marshal Reed nodded slowly. Noted, deputy. He turned back to Elias. Get some rest. We ride at first light. That night, huddled together in the cold line shack while the lawmen took turns keeping watch. Margaret and Elias held each other. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. But you did the right thing. Coming forward. Maybe. Or maybe I'm about to hang for revenge I should have left to God. Margaret pulled back to look at him. She reached up and took off Sarah's locket, pressing it into his hand. Take this. Wear it. To remember what you're fighting for. Elias closed his fingers around the locket. I thought this was for you. It is. But you need it more right now. She fastened it around his neck. To remember that you have people who love you, who are waiting for you, who believe you deserve a second chance. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. They did not sleep that night, just held each other and waited for dawn. Morning came cold and clear. As the group prepared to ride out, Margaret made a decision. Wait, she called out as Marshal Reed mounted his horse. The lawman turned. Ma'am. Margaret walked up to where Elias stood beside his horse. She took both his hands in hers and looked up at him. Then she turned to face the marshal. I want to speak on his behalf, now, before we go. Miss Ellis, that's what the trial is for. No! Margaret's voice was firm. I want you to hear this now, you and your deputies, because you need to know who this man really is. Marshal Reed exchanged glances with his men, then nodded. All right. Go ahead. Margaret took a breath. 3 months ago, I was dying on a train station bench. Everyone had left. The storm had closed in. I had nowhere to go and no one who cared if I lived or died. Her voice steadied as she continued. This man rode out of that storm and saved my life. He took me to his cabin, fed me, clothed me, kept me safe through the entire winter. That's commendable, ma'am, but it doesn't erase I'm not finished. Margaret's eyes flashed. He could have taken advantage of my situation. I was alone, dependent, desperate. He could have demanded anything from me, and I would have had no choice but to comply. But he didn't. He treated me with respect and kindness. He gave me his bed while he slept on the floor. He taught me how to survive. He shared his grief and his pain with me, and never once did he make me feel like a burden. Deputy Miller was watching her with obvious sympathy. Even Deputy Hawthorne looked less skeptical than before. This man lost everything, Margaret continued. His wife, his daughter, his whole future. And yes, he made a terrible choice in his grief. But in the 5 years since, he's lived with that guilt every single day. He's punished himself more than any law could punish him. She turned to look at Elias, and tears spilled down her cheeks. And despite everything, he chose to turn himself in, to face justice, because he wanted to build a real life with me. An honest life, Margaret, Elias whispered, his own eyes wet. She turned back to Marshal Reed. I'm asking you to remember that when you testify at his trial, that Elias Boone is not a monster. He's a good man who did a terrible thing for understandable reasons, and he deserves a chance to make amends. The marshal was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than before. I'll remember, Miss Ellis. You have my word on that. Thank you. Margaret returned to Elias and took his hands again. I'll be waiting for you. However long it takes, you don't have to wait. If I don't come back, stop. She pressed her fingers to his lips. You're coming back. We're going to get married, and we're going to build the life we talked about. I won't accept any other outcome. Elias pulled her into his arms one last time. I love you, he said against her hair. No matter what happens, remember that. I love you too. And I'll see you in Cheyenne. Marshal Reed cleared his throat. Miss Ellis, you're welcome to ride with us. Might be safer than traveling alone. Thank you, Marshal. I appreciate that. The group mounted up and began the journey to Cheyenne. Margaret rode beside Elias, close enough to touch but unable to hold him. The deputy stayed alert but not aggressive. Marshal Reed set a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling. As they rode, Deputy Miller fell back to ride beside Margaret. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes. "My sister's name was Clara," he said quietly. "She was 16 when the fever took her. My mother never recovered from it. Died of heartbreak 6 months later." Margaret looked at him. "I'm sorry for your loss. What I'm trying to say is, I understand what Mr. Boone did. And I'll speak up for him too, if it'll help. Tell the judge about Clara, about how men who spread sickness are murderers themselves." "Thank you," Margaret said, hope rising in her chest. "That means more than you know." They rode on through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As the sun began to set, painting the snow orange and pink, the town of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys. Lights began to twinkle in windows. Civilization, law, justice, and somewhere in that town, in a courtroom that did not yet know they were coming, Elias's fate would be decided. Margaret reached over and touched his hand briefly. He looked at her and managed a small smile. Whatever came next, they had made it this far, together, and that was something. Marshal Reed led them down the main street as twilight fell. People stopped to stare at the group, 3 lawmen, a mountain man, and a woman riding into town with purpose. By morning, everyone would know. The story would spread: the widow and the mountain man, the rescue and the revenge, the love that grew in the coldest winter. Their story was just beginning to be told. And like all true stories, no one yet knew how it would end. 2 months passed, like a held breath. Margaret found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who asked no questions and charged reasonable rates. She took work as a seamstress, her skilled hands keeping her fed while she waited. Every penny she did not need for survival went into a jar on her dresser. Money for a lawyer. Money for the future. She hired Albert Thornton, a young attorney with more idealism than experience, but with fire in his eyes when she told him Elias's story. He took the case for less than his usual fee, saying some battles were worth fighting regardless of pay. Margaret visited Elias once a week at the jail. Marshal Reed, true to his word, ensured he was treated fairly. Elias was given a clean cell, decent food, and the dignity of being treated as a man awaiting trial rather than a condemned criminal. Each visit, they sat across from each other at a rough wooden table, hands clasped, and talked about everything and nothing. Margaret told him about the town, about Mrs. Patterson's cat who had adopted her, about the lawyer and his plans for the defense. Elias listened and smiled and sometimes laughed, and in those moments, Margaret could almost forget where they were. "You're getting thinner," she said during one visit, worry in her voice. "Food's not as good as yours." He squeezed her hands. "I'll be fine, Margaret. Don't worry about me. That's like asking me not to breathe." The trial began on a wet April morning. The courtroom was packed with curious townspeople, journalists, and the families of the men Elias had killed. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, Sarah's locket hidden beneath her collar. The prosecution laid out the facts efficiently. 3 men shot, no trial, no due process. Pure revenge killing. They presented Elias as a dangerous man who had taken the law into his own hands and must be punished to the fullest extent. Then it was the defense's turn. Albert Thornton stood and addressed the jury with quiet passion. He did not deny what Elias had done. Instead, he provided context. He brought forth records showing the 3 dead men had been wanted in multiple territories. He presented testimony from towns they had passed through, leaving sickness and death in their wake. Then he called Margaret to the stand. She walked up slowly, aware of every eye on her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat and looked out at the courtroom. "Mrs. Ellis," Thornton began, "can you tell the court how you came to know the defendant?" Margaret told the story simply. The storm, the station, Elias appearing like an answer to a prayer. She had not known how to pray. Her voice was steady as she described the winter in the cabin, Elias's kindness, his grief, his fundamental decency. "Did you ever feel threatened by Mr. Boone?" Thornton asked. "Never, not once." "Did he ever demand anything from you in exchange for his help?" "No, he asked for nothing. expected nothing. The prosecutor tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, suggesting she was biased by affection. Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I am biased by truth, sir. I know what I experienced. I know the man I came to love. And I know that good people are capable of terrible things when grief breaks them. The question is not whether Mr. Boone did wrong. He did. The question is whether mercy is possible for a man who has spent 5 years punishing himself and who came forward willingly to face justice." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge called for order. Marshal Reed testified next, explaining the circumstances of Elias's surrender. Deputy Miller spoke about his sister and about the nature of the men Elias had killed. Even Deputy Hawthorne, when called, grudgingly admitted that Elias had been cooperative and peaceful during his arrest. Finally, Elias himself took the stand. He did not try to defend his actions or minimize them. He simply told the truth about Sarah and Emma, about the fever, about tracking the men who had caused it and shooting them, about the 5 years of isolation and guilt. "I did wrong," he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "I know that. I've known it every day since. If I could go back and choose differently, I would. But I can't. All I can do is accept the consequences of my actions and try to be a better man going forward." He looked directly at the jury. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make amends, to live a life that honors the people I've lost, instead of compounding their deaths with more violence and waste." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Margaret sat rigid in her seat, barely breathing. Mrs. Patterson had come to sit beside her, offering silent support. Albert Thornton paced in the hallway. Elias was returned to his cell to wait. When the jury returned, the foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter in the deaths of 3 men. Margaret's heart clenched. Guilty, but manslaughter, not murder. That was something. However, the foreman continued, "We recommend mercy in sentencing given the extraordinary circumstances and the defendant's character as testified to by multiple witnesses." The judge, an older man with intelligent eyes, studied the verdict. Then he looked at Elias. "Mr. Boone, you have been found guilty of taking 3 lives. That is a serious crime and cannot go unpunished. However, this court recognizes the provocation you suffered and your cooperation with the law. I sentence you to 5 years in the territorial prison with the possibility of early release for good behavior. 5 years. Not death, not life. 5 years. Margaret felt tears stream down her face. It was harsh, but it was survivable. It was hope. After the sentencing, she was allowed a brief moment with Elias before he was taken away. They held each other through the bars, and he whispered, 5 years. "We can do 5 years. I'll wait," Margaret promised. "I'll be here every month. And when you get out, we'll get married and start our life. Don't wait if something better comes along," he said, but she could hear he did not mean it. "Nothing better will come along. You're it for me, Elias Boone." He kissed her then, desperate and tender. Then the guards came, and he was led away. Margaret stood in the courthouse hallway watching him go. Mrs. Patterson put an arm around her shoulders. 5 years, the older woman said gently. "It'll pass faster than you think." "I know." Margaret touched the locket at her throat. "And I'll be ready when he comes home." She walked out of the courthouse into spring sunshine. The world was green and growing. Somewhere up in the mountains, the cabin sat empty but waiting. And somewhere ahead, years from now, a wedding waited. A life waited. A future built on love and forgiveness, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Margaret Ellis had lost everything twice over. But she had found something too. Something worth fighting for. Worth waiting for. And that, she thought, was what it meant to survive, to endure, to hope. She walked back to the boarding house with her head high, already counting down the days until her next visit, already planning the life they would build when Elias came home. The story of the widow and the mountain man was far from over. It was only just beginning.